Welcome again to another episode of Unapologetic Leadership. And I have an esteemed guest, Dr. Hollie Blagg. And she's technology executive and an entrepreneur. And she's a lot more than that, but we'll see what she shares today. And I know it's going to be an exciting episode. So welcome, Hollie.
Thank you, Cory. It's so nice to be here. As you mentioned, I have a very multidimensional life. Entrepreneur at heart. My husband and I own 6 different organizations. And then on top of that, my day job revolves around living and breathing in a technology consulting organization, which I've spent probably the past 6 years focusing in on the Google business.
Awesome. Thank you. And what's your biggest passion or time spent? Maybe how about your biggest passion? Because that's not always the same as the most amount of time spent.
Well, I would say my biggest passion in general is learning. I like learning either on the job when it relates to new challenges and new problems to solve. As you mentioned, earlier, I just recently became a doctorate as of last Thursday.
Congrats.
That was a long road. But, it kind of goes down to, I had a need and a desire to learn more about organizational leadership, especially with small business tech organizations. And in my business, it's all about innovation and creativity. So you really can't, compete in this marketplace without unleashing those capabilities and that craft within your organization. So I recently, as I mentioned, finished my PhD centered around those concepts. The whole process was honestly fascinating. Most degrees, I think that you go into, you kind of get a breadth of the content material across many different subjects. So your MBA is covering things like finance, from supply chain to management. And, your bachelors are typically a spattering of what you're interested in, plus your core degree. But what I loved about this particular program was you could go really deep and unpack and unearth material and concepts and even come up with some of your own through your research on a particular subject matter. And so I love learning. In the past 4.5 years, I've really immersed myself in leadership structures and cultures and the design of innovational systems to help unleash that craft into the marketplace and within organizations as a whole. So that was one element of learning. I've got a bucket list, though, the next 7 things I want to do with my life that all center around just soaking up all that information that's out there.
Oh, that's fantastic. What is one of the biggest leadership lessons you've learned, whether over the last year or maybe there's something else that happened previous?
Yeah, I think a combination of my leadership experience, but also with this degree, if I were to pick the most recent one, it's really been centered around, I hate saying this because this was the one statement that would drive me nuts of, it depends. Okay. So, I often think, and when I was first coming into leadership, it was very much, people are coming to me, I've got to give them an answer. So, very black and white in how, I would look at things. I would also look at things and try to apply concepts that didn't really, account for the nuances that exist out there. And when I look at what you need in the startup mentality or startup concepts versus like how you lead, how you make your decisions, it really is contingent on certain situational variables, which can include things like the culture that you've built or the systems and structures that you've designed and all these other things. And so, I would say twofold. I learned early on that you're not always going to have the answers. You have to bring people around you within your organization that do, that complement you. But most recently, it's about, you don't have to have all the answers because you have to be aware contextually of the situational variables that are going to impact decisions as you move forward or how you move on to that next step. So very much situational. When people come and ask me a question, I'm starting to sound like a professor, but I say it depends. And then I, kind of want to have a deeper dialogue of like, what are the blockers? What is the context of the client, in this point in time? Where are we at with this solution? Because it could go one or two different ways. And there's not just like this peanut butter spread approach. And I often think that people would love that. It makes it easier, that's for sure. But you're not going to get to the right answer. And you might have a lot of rework if you try that approach. So I think
Mhm.
more recently I've gotten comfortable, way more comfortable with sitting back and having a deeper conversation if you have that time to understand what the surrounding, contingencies are around the situation so you can choose the right path. Because honestly, it's all about options.
Right.
There's never one way of doing things. It's like if you go down this path, what are the things you need to look out for? What do you need to expect? What things could you uncover or unearth? And that's all it is. And so I think sometimes we move so fast. The singular answer is usually the easiest, but it's not always the right one.
No, those are a lot of great points. And as you've just spoken about the whole idea of having clarity, because there's so many options out there. And instead of wanting to rush head forward into so many different things and waste time potentially and resources and money, it's better in order to speed up. It's important to slow down.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's really not like an older concept or anything. I mean, we said it a lot, but I think the challenge nowadays is people are just so used to moving. They're so used to the constant like interaction, whether it be phones or at work, and multitasking is, sort of the norm.
Yeah.
And I think if you try to slow down in the world that we live in today, it's really difficult. If you ever had a chance to where you want to sit and kind of meditate or just garner your thoughts, I've done this exercise. It's kind of a fun one. You sit there with a notepad and a pen and you just sit in stillness for a little bit. And then tally each time your brain moves and shifts, like where you're kind of coming back, coming to your breathing,
Right.
because we've kind of programmed ourselves for this very fast paced, hyper intensive distraction environment. And so it's really hard for people to slow down because when they sit there a little bit in the problem, for example, it's like their mind's already shifting to the next thing. And so as we get to be better problem solvers, I think we have to get really good in being present in that moment without the distraction. And that is like any other muscle. You have to practice it because the world around us is not going to slow down and it's going to continue to push these very accelerated cycles on us. So we just got to be cognizant of that because slowing down is important, but we often don't make the time. And our bodies right now are not often programmed to operate in that way.
Yeah, no, those are once again a bunch of great points you mentioned that, as you said, the world will kind of program us in that way. And one thing I tend to think of is if you think of TikToks and YouTube videos, they're getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And we're not realizing that, oh my gosh, I remember, what was it? I can't remember if it was the download of something. And it literally took 3 seconds to download after I clicked on it. But I thought, what's taking so long? Just subconsciously, I thought that I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so impatient. Clicking something and having to wait 3 seconds for it. So how do you suggest that people, as you said, you have to build that muscle to slow down, to be intentional, and not necessarily listen or follow what the world's doing and how we've been programmed. But how do you suggest? I know you suggested an activity of just sitting there and just tracking how your thoughts move back and forth and how often they switch. Do you have any areas that might be able to help some people?
Yeah, and I just could go back to that example because often people will do this and then, there's a negative emotion that's assigned. Like when I did it, I was like, oh my gosh, I did 26 times in like a minute. My mind wandered when I was telling. And don't do the tally all the time, but it gives you a sense of how much your mind is kind of pinging on different areas in your life. So the major piece of advice in that exercise is offer yourself grace. Everybody's experienced kind of information overload. Everybody's experiencing the context switching. Everyone's experiencing a much faster paced world with the demands on it. So practice, offer yourself grace, and do it consistently. And I think that you'll find that attention spans and being present in those moments, you'll see that kind of lengthen. Maybe you can do it for 30 seconds and that's okay. Celebrate that win. Maybe the next time you do it, it's up to 40 seconds. And, over time, you'll get there to where you're really kind of in that moment for a longer period of time so that when you're talking to your coworkers or you're talking to your family members, you really can sense that like, I am really taking everything in and I'm very focused on this and you'll see that change. But again, it takes practice and time. But I also encourage, individuals to not try to rush to the answer immediately, practicing sitting in a problem for a bit. And that could be a problem that you have to solve, or it might be a problem that someone comes to you. And so if a problem, that someone comes to you with, I think the first step is ask at least 3 to 5 questions, because all that's going to do, it might not be, there might be some high levels and you might have a couple deeper questions, but you're starting to practice peeling back the layers and the onion a little bit more. In some ways, it's not always what you're going to get out of that, but it's the effort to stay centered and focused on the topic at hand. And by asking questions, you're going to get more information so you can keep digging down into that. Even if the questions are answers that you know, it just keeps you kind of honed in on that particular content block, so to speak. And then in addition, like I'm a big fan of, your body is kind of your temple. Keep it healthy. There's so much, foods out there. We eat from convenience. And I think sometimes we got to be careful about what we put in our bodies, because there's a reality that certain foods are, not going to help with brain fog. Certain foods will. So kind of keeping, your diet and your health and your exercise in mind is also going to help you be much more present and in the moment, because you're putting in stuff that's not going to further cloud your judgment or further cloud your brain, creating that brain fog, which makes it really difficult to problem solve and honestly just to process. So those are just 3 easy things that anyone can do with practice and with consistency.
Yeah, no, those are all great points. And I know that, in the Bible, since I'm a Christian, God talks about how your body is your temple, just like you mentioned. And that if we don't take care of our bodies, as you said, the brain fog, the attention span, the energy levels we have aren't going to be in a place. And I call it basically the filter you look out from. If you're not able to sleep well, everything else, and you just don't have the energy or focus, you got to start there with kind of that self-leadership area. And of course, your health is the biggest thing there. So those are fantastic. Yeah. Have you always been this cognizant of your body and energy and eating and for fuel, or what?
Absolutely not. I will say I am the biggest offender of my 3 things in the past 4.5 years. I worked for a different tech company a couple years back, and talk about information overload or, context switching. There would be days where I'd have 14 to 16 meetings in a day, and they're like at 30-minute blocks, right? So I remember me and one of my friends in this organization, we came up with a list of things that you can make for lunch in 3 minutes or less, so that you could grab it, cook it, and go. And our favorite was either the hot and ready ramen bowls, which are full of sodium. Who knows what else is in there? And then things like crack a couple eggs and scramble up those eggs and throw them in the microwave for 3 minutes, So my eating was terrible. I'll be honest with you, going from the day-to-day work to actually trying to, study at night. It's about 20 to 25 hours a week to do my PhD. Anyways, I had to work out. So now that things have calmed down, and over the past 6 months, I've really taken an intentional position to put my health first. And I can tell you there's a difference. There's a difference in how I'm eating, just doing basic exercise, even if it's like walking, in which my showing up every day and being present is a lot easier than it was. There would be days where, and there's a meme, and I don't know if I could find it for you, but you see this person kind of laying down on the couch at the end of the day, and they're just glaring. And, there's so many days where by the time my day was done, I put my head on my couch, and things were moving and shifting around me. I didn't know if it was my kids. I didn't know my husband. I just couldn't process any additional information that day. And, I think the health piece contributed a lot, because I wasn't taking care of my health, and I was just trying to get through the next thing or the next day. And, it takes a toll. But if you recognize it, I think that's when you can make a change. Every day is a new beginning, and every day you have this wondrous opportunity to do great things, to learn something new. I'm a big proponent that, I never want to sit still, because I'm I want to learn a language, or I want to maybe it's me, my husband starting another company. There's always something out there, and so when I talk about that fast pace and constantly moving and distractions and context switching, I have a horrible time with that, because it's driven from the need to not sit still and to really soak up as much of life as I can. So, but it's a balance. And I'm still learning how to effectively execute.
Yeah, I totally hear you there, because as you said, when you learn new things, it actually opens you up to newer things and new avenues of thinking, strategies, and everything else. And I know on your LinkedIn profile, and when we talked before, you have systems thinker on your profile. Yeah, can you tell me a little bit more about that? And also, too, putting a little spin on it, do you ever use systems thinking when it comes to your family?
You know, I've used design thinking with my family, especially with my kids. So I'm a big fan of Post-its. I love having us, like, even with like family vacations, is I'm going to put my Post-its on the board indicating like where I want to go on vacation, and you put yours, and oh, look at, there's a pattern and theme here that we both want to be in sunny, warm places. But there is a lot of movement, if I take out the design thinking kind of system that people can operate in. But the system thinking, it's used every day, especially in our personal businesses, because there's a constant need to go tactical to do the thing that you need to do because of resource constraint and capacity issues. When you're a startup, you're not going to have everybody that you need in order to execute. So you're wearing a lot of hats. But there's also this piece where you're going to pull up and you really have to understand about the landscape around you and how pulling a lever over here could affect something over there. And I think when you come from a space where there's like a core competency, right? Like if I'm a finance person and I'm kind of zoomed in on finance, if you haven't pulled up and worked in other areas of the business and you make changes to that side of the business, you're not going to really understand how that impacts operations or how that impacts marketing and sales. And so the beauty of being in small business and startup mode is that you're often playing in those spaces naturally. And the other beauty is that when you do make changes, you're going to be much more, quick to see how those changes are impacting different areas of the business. So you can make quick changes and you can pivot, you can pilot things, but you can really understand, holistically how the system works together and how it kind of feeds each other, from a business unit or competency perspective.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And also too, I know you mentioned when we were talking before that you had that you talked about your faith. Are you comfortable with sharing a little bit of that and some of your maybe changes or nuances that have really started to show up in the last couple of months?
Absolutely. Faith is a big part of me and my family. When we chatted last, I talked about my youngest daughter, who is so strong in her faith. She really makes me want to be better at executing and learning and living my faith day to day. So I'm really blessed in that regard. How we talked earlier about just in general finding space. I've done meditation and I think it's great. But what I've really kind of evolved that into is really prayer time. Every morning, I get up super early. I do my workout now. Maybe not but like when I do my walks, I usually spend about an hour, with either praying and or learning more about the Bible stories and the messages that come from it. I always tell people we're all sinners. I'm definitely one of them. And every day I get up and I think the first thing I say in prayer is, help me to do better, because this is what I did yesterday and I wasn't really proud of some of these things. And this is where I need your strength, or this is where, I need help, which is hard for me in general to ask. But, in prayer, I think it's a lot easier. And I want to start my day that way because I'm nothing without him. And, every challenge, everything that I wanted to do in my life has been by the grace that he has given me. And so, that routine of spending an hour in prayer time or an hour in, learning about the Bible and I've got great apps. There's, some wonderful apps out there, Hallow being amazing, where I get to learn more. And like I said, my youngest daughter has continued to teach me things. And I sometimes feel like I've got to catch up to her because even though I was born and raised a Catholic, she knows so much about Bible and the Bible stories. So I spend a little time in prayer, and then I bring up, I have to learn this part of the Bible so that I can keep pace with her, because she just is really pushing me to do that. And, honestly, now that, school is done, I mentioned it's like 25 hours of work on that I would do a week.
Oh, yeah.
I have time to go to church again. And I find so much peace and comfort in church. The music, just sitting there as a community. I build my strength from that. And so, my next goal now that I'm a week out is this will be like the first Sunday I think that I can go to church, which I was like those Easter, Christmas people, and because it's like on Sunday, I need 9 hours on Sunday to get this thing done. So I'm going to be able to sit there and not worry about having to be somewhere else or to rush home to write a paper or to turn in a paper. And I gave myself, because it shouldn't be the case. I should have always made time. But like I said, every day you show up and, you try to do better. And I think that as you try, it's like we're not perfect, and that's okay. Like Jesus knows that, but he's always there waiting for us to show back up. And so the action is to show up, and to keep on showing up.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. And I also talk about that too, that there's so many things with my routine, and there's things that distract me from my typical routine of praying, reflecting on the word, and sometimes going to worship, like you said, and also the people in our environment. So you sound so blessed to have your daughter who is just so on top of it with her relationship with God. And I think that's pretty awesome. And also, yeah. And then you also made a great point on just not beating yourself up. Because I think there's a lot of people, and I didn't realize this about me, but there's this perfectionistic attitude that, man, if I don't do it the way I think I should do it, there's almost no reason for me to even try because I'm so disappointed. And have you ever been in that position? Because I know you said you try to do better every day, but.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a moment, and yes, I will say, yes, I have just been disappointed in myself many times. And it's really like, how I show up to things. I think a lot of times, sometimes you can go super inward because of this perfectionist tendencies. You're like, oh, I could have done this better. So I'm going to swirl around this drain of what I didn't do perfect, or this really, terrible presentation I gave, or missing, volleyball practice, or whatever it is. And you can swirl and swirl around that drain for a long time. Perfectionists tend to want to dissect what I did wrong and how I can do better next time. And it's a lead to get you from point A to point B because you kind of harp on it. You're like disappointed in yourself. And this was just super recent. What I got this feedback from a parent at my daughter's school. She's the mother of a daughter that was on my daughter's volleyball team. And it was a different context, but I think it applies in a situation where she said, when you hear those things of doubt, or where you can't do something, or where you screwed up and, shame on you, she's like, that's all the devil just talking to you. That is him putting seeds into your brain to separate you from continuing to have a relationship with God. And I have thought about that nonstop. And so I think it applies in this situation is when we stir around that drain of what we did wrong and how we could do better. I think we kind of go back to say, well, who's kind of planting those seeds, and does those seeds serve a purpose? Does it get us closer to God, or does it separate us from God? Because we're now not thinking about that relationship with him. We are now thinking inward about us. And that's, it's not much space in there if we're just thinking inward about us, because it has to be an open door. It's like a pipe, right? The water can't flow if one of the ends is cut off. And so I thought that was just amazing, insight. And so now when those things happen where I get stuck on something or frustrated with something, I really am like, are those my thoughts? Or like, is this helping me? I kind of think like, I'm not going to let you do this. Nope, because that's all it's going to do is pull me inward, and I need to remain outward with an open dialogue and relationship with my Lord.
Oh, I think that's fantastic. And as you were alluding to many times, is that when we're spending time over here focusing on maybe some limiting beliefs or some doubts and not focusing on what God and Christ has done for us, then we're kind of crowding out what God, we're crowding out some of these things. So it's so important to be intentional. And one of the other areas I was going to mention is just having that awareness, whether you talked about being aware of how your body feels with what you're eating and how you exercise, along with some of the thoughts and what you're focusing on. And if you don't have the awareness, you're kind of going on autopilot. And I love to use aviation terms because I'm a private pilot. I've had a license for about 30 something years. Yeah. Yeah, but it's so true. You go on autopilot, and some things it's okay. If you've got some really uplifting habits and routines, it's still important to be aware of them. But if you've got those, that helps. But sometimes there are those patterns that we just don't even recognize. It just seems normal because we're
Yeah.
emotional beings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's totally true. And I think in the end of the day, you know, it's constantly like I go back to being present, because like autopilot is more of a habitual act versus like I'm being present and really feeling each of those moments as I'm experiencing them, as I'm talking about them, as I'm doing that thing. And, it was one of the
Yeah.
things that I learned in like my PhD process, similar concept, but I kept having to take a step back and saying, you know what? This is such an amazing experience. Like, soak up the journey, soak up the fact that you are learning things that you otherwise would have never learned, soak up the fact that you're doing research and you might uncover some pattern or theme that is groundbreaking, or maybe that it will be helpful for the small business entrepreneur who's trying to really accelerate innovation and growth. Like, I was like, just take a step back and think about what it is you're doing. And a lot of times, and for many people, it might not be necessary in the workday, but if they're in that moment to really be like, wow, this is pretty cool. I mean, if it's a volleyball game or watching your kid do a spike at the net, you can tell my kids have sports, right? You've got your plane analogies, and I've got my, my women's sports analogies, right? But, if you think about it, it's, sometimes you're seeing with, you're watching without seeing. And, and then sometimes you're really seeing the thing that you are watching. And there's been times when I've been watching their like practices or games. And, when I was in a break at school, I remember watching my daughter jump up and spike the ball. And I was like, oh my God, look at that vertical. Like, for whatever reason, it never clicked because I was, just watching. I wasn't really seeing. And so it helps, I think, not only in, work, but like in personal life. It's just like that being present. I also think it helps being present because, that's when you can have a relationship, that direct relationship. If you're in that moment and you're really soaking in the relationships, the communications, the interactions, you can't build a relationship if you're passive. And that's true for our Lord too. And that's what my daughter has taught me. She's always saying, just talk to him. You just have to keep talking to him, Mom. Like he hears you. And, for a 15-year-old, I still get shocked. She's so strong in her faith. And I'm like, she's so right. But I just feel like, it's such a difficult concept for me to understand. So, it's a journey. And, even though I was raised, as I said, Catholic, I think the reality is I'm kind of almost going back to the basics and trying to reestablish, my core again with my faith. But it's a different way I'm engaging. I engaged as a kid because my parents are like, this is what you are, and this is how we as a family are going to engage. This time around, it's kind of interesting because I'm engaging in a way that is different, but it's so much more fulfilling because I want to be there. I want to show up. I want to have this relationship. And so, true for God versus true for your coworkers versus true for your family members is, any relationship that you build, you got to want to be there. You got to want to be present. And you got to want to engage and invest.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And especially when you use the word fulfilled, I think of the words just taking ownership of your faith, your life, your business, and then talking to God about that for him to bless these things that you would like. And another question I had for you was, how have you stayed aligned with your values and vision when pressure is on? And I think you did allude to this and you shared some of this already, but how have you stayed aligned with that? Or maybe that's changed at times.
Yeah, I think it's definitely changed over my professional career. I think in the beginning, when you're in a new organization or you're new into the workforce, especially, it's really hard to like anchor on your values and your convictions. You as a youngster, you want to get a job, you want to get paid, and you want to get out of your parents' house, right? But even more so, just like with any societal norms, you kind of go into an environment and there's a norm that's there. Sometimes that norm is, contradictory to how you live your life, and sometimes it's 80% of the way there, right? And I would say in the beginning of my professional career, I kind of went with the flow. I'll be honest with you, I wasn't really looking at anything deeper. It was just like, oh, it's work, it's a paycheck, and I've got some friends there, right? It wasn't very deep. But as you get older, and I think as you go on like the spiritual journey, as you go on and you get older and, relationships take on new meanings, it's, work becomes really important to you. You spend so much time at work that you want to do something of meaning. You want to make a difference, and I think in those cases, like there have been times where I just stayed silent when things kind of, felt icky, or I didn't say anything because I didn't want to disrupt the norm that existed in that culture and that environment. And my path was like, I don't want to, muddy the waters. I don't want to rock the boats. So it's a position I think often a lot of people take because, of those reasons. But what happens is rather than being who you are and authentically you in that moment, you hide that, and then you're now carrying a weight that really kind of weighs you down, doesn't unleash your full potential, doesn't unleash the fact that you have all these things to offer because you become scared of being who you really are. And, I think in some environments, if it gets too unbalanced, I haven't had this experience yet, but if it gets too unbalanced, I have seen people who have like left organizations or left friendships, had, chasms when it comes to like the family dynamics. And, at the end of the day, I think that, what I always hope is that, everybody can bring themselves to work wholly and presently who they, and who they are and what they embody, the authentic self. And you hear that a lot, but I, sometimes, I can relate to like, can you truly bring your authentic self here? Maybe it's like, the bowling club, on Monday, like, can you bring yourself present? I don't think you avoid those situations. I think, I've avoided it. I've stayed silent in some cases, but I do think that you're going to bring yourself who you are as long as you respect others. And, most of the, like our teachings tell us like we should, love our neighbors, and this, my world is like, be kind, be treated the way you want to be treated. Then I don't think you have to hide yourself and who you are in order to be present in the way that you need to be. And as long as you're kind of underlying principles and you're kind of leaning into the fact that you're being kind and you just have a difference of outlook or opinion, that should be accepted. But we live in a world where for whatever reason, we go to our corners and we go to our positions. And to get people out of that, sometimes it can be testing and debatable, but like do it in good faith. Like there's no, I'm a New Yorker, so we like to argue. So it doesn't bother me arguing, and it doesn't bother me having an active, like really different perspective and dialogue. I actually love it. I love learning how other people think and like how their brain operates and the ideas that they bring. Like that really excites me, but that's not always the temperament of everyone else. But my hope is that as we move forward is that people can bring who they are. That might be in direct contradiction with what you believe, but we should all be able to live in a space to respect those opinions and respect those differences. And then afterwards, maybe go and have a beer, have a glass of wine, or just like, hang out without the conflict and the friction. That conversation, that diversity, that dialogue just aims to make us better. And it really widens the lens of what's out there and what's available to us, that we can do, as a community, as an organization.
I think that's great. And that also kind of leads into my last question I have for you is just, what's one bold move you've made even when you felt unqualified or unsure? And then what did you learn?
Yeah. I think there was two. One was obviously the PhD. I totally did not think I was going to get that done. And there was plenty of times where I wanted to quit, where I was like, I just don't belong in this space. Like this is, there's a lot of things out there for Hollie, but this isn't it.
And why is that? Maybe you're going to say that, but why is that? You didn't feel it was for you?
No, I wasn't, but it's a great question. And it's really because it's super intimidating. I think people look at others that have a PhD. I mean, I can say this very recently. I would look at people who had a PhD and like, oh, they're so much smarter. And, could I challenge that idea? Or I have it's going back to like authentic stuff. Can you bring your ideas? Can you bring that dialogue that you fully believe in? And I just didn't think like, if they said it, that must be right. I'm like, I don't have a PhD. They have a PhD. And I think what it came down to just over the process was a level, it's a confidence factor. That's what it came down to of, believing in yourself. Because I remember I had a conversation with my mentor and she's like, what, why are you doing this? Like, you just need a doctorate. You need a DO. You don't need a PhD. And I was like, you know what? Well, I got something to say. And that title or whatever, that is going to, like, people will listen if I have that. And she was like, yeah, you're right. And what I had to say was around innovation and creativity in small business, because I thoroughly am very passionate about that subject. And I had a very strong opinion. I don't think my intelligence changed throughout this program, but my confidence did. My confidence to go out and say what I needed to say. And not necessarily because I have any titles or anything, but because I learned so much. I have all this data and insight that I can pull from. And when you're armed with information and you're not making like a gut call, like it helps to bolster that confidence. So I think that was one bold move. And then, another bold move was kind of along the same lines of confidence, where I went, I've been in several different organizations, and part of why I went to do the PhD was because there was a consistent pattern in themes of what happens after growth stage in a small business, and how can you really help stabilize and accelerate growth versus seeing it, tick downward after a growth spurt. And it happened like 3 times. I was like, I've seen this before, and, when you're sitting in front of the chief executives of your organization and you have an idea or an opinion and you want to advise and you're advising in those capacities, it takes that confidence where, I remember I'm like, just step up, stand up, say what you got to say. And they're either going to like it or they're not. But if you don't go in with here's my perspective based on these experiences, and you go in with a lukewarm answer, but I mean, this is kind of what I learned is when I just actually had the courage to say what I had to say, and here's my point of view, and here's why I think this, and this is what I've seen. It just changed the whole dynamic. People were appreciative. They're like, well, that's why we hired you. We were looking for you to provide those insights, but there's an intimidation factor when you're not necessarily at that level. And, some of the experiences of those people collectively around the room, you're like, wow, how do I compete with that? Will they take me seriously? It's all those, circling back to, where are those thoughts coming from? Because, those are thoughts that, I know that my God and your God, they're not planting those. So those seeds of doubt, where are they coming from? And is that going to aid you in, your goals, your relationships, both here and more those heavenly relationships. So I started really honing in on the only thing that's holding me back is confidence and really buying into the internal talk that is trying to separate me from my goals and from the key relationships I need to have in this life. So there was a couple of bold moments where I could tell you I was scared to death, both accounts, both at this particular meeting and taking the step forward to get my PhD.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And I just want to thank you again, Dr. Hollie Blagg, for being here. And I appreciate you sharing everything about small businesses, PhDs, family, faith, and so much more, even our health, our fitness and our health. So I appreciate all of that. And what's the best way for people to get in touch with you and maybe what's important to you and what you're looking for?
Yeah. If anyone wants to get a hold of me, I'm on LinkedIn. It's Dr. Hollie Blagg. I'm always open to, supporting organizations, leveraging that knowledge I recently acquired. But in general, on any aspects of people's journey, whether it's, mentorship, whether it's strategy, whether it's faith, and just kind of needing sort of an accountability partner if you need and want to get back to where you were, or maybe it's a place that you want to go. I love, meeting new people, new relationships, and I'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again. And I thank you for listening to this episode of Unapologetic Leadership. And remember to stay aware, be purposeful, and know which values that you're operating out of. Thank you, everyone, for listening.